welcome everyone. I am so grateful to see interest in this topic. The speakers today are impressive in their own right, and as a collective, I think they will provide deeper insights into social issues that are actually preoccupying, if not occupying, policing currently. The question is how emerging technologies are shaping policing. We're going to focus on one type of technology. It's a rapid drug analysis tool introduced by Spectra Plasmonics. And we're going to find out how this can help policing. One of its benefits is that it can reduce the exposure of our frontline responders, in this case, police officers, to the hazards associated to chemicals, particularly the chemicals in drugs. And some of those hazards can be seriously life-altering, if not fatal. And so the introduction of a technology that can provide an enhanced degree of public safety to our police officers has to be a benefit. We probably would immediately think, conventionally, that this is something that the police ought to grab onto. The interesting aspect, though, is that this product, this device, this technology also starts to collect information. And the information can have some consequences for the community in terms of privacy, charter protection, safe storage, derivative use. So we're going to explore some of those aspects today. And to explore those aspects, we have the Canadian Civil Liberties Association working with us today to talk about those issues. And then, because this is a policing webinar, we have experts in policing, in developing procedures and policies around police technology and police operations. And we'll hear from the CEO of Consilium, which is a consultant organization that works with public sector agencies, particularly police. Now, when it comes time, I will introduce each one of the speakers directly with a little bit more elaboration, but that sets the stage. So as Dave said, this is an interactive experience, so we encourage comments and questions. The speakers would prefer to have them present prior to taking questions. So we'll give each speaker a few minutes to make their presentation, and then we'll invite some questions following each one of the speakers. And then we've reserved some time at the end of the webinar to have a more general conversation. So at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Malcolm Eade, who is the CEO and co-founder of Spectra Plasmonics. It's a Canadian technology company developing real-time drug analysis tools that help public safety agencies and municipalities respond more effectively to the fentanyl overdose crisis. The company's flagship solution, Amplifi ID, enables frontline teams to identify the chemical makeup of street drugs in as little as 60 seconds, producing shareable data that strengthens local intelligence and national surveillance efforts. At Spectra, Malcolm leads partnerships and strategies, working with organizations across Canada and the United States to improve frontline safety and support evidence-based decision-making. Great pleasure to introduce Malcolm. Malcolm, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I'm just going to pop into my screen. And get that into presenter mode for you all. If there's any challenges, just give me a shout and I'll adjust. So thanks very much. As Mike mentioned, I am the CEO of Spectra Plasmonics. So for today's webinar panel, the areas that I will discuss, which will hopefully frame today's discussions, I will give a little bit of a background of us and who we are, and a background on the technology and benefits to policing. more for information, just to help contextualize the discussion and visualize how the technology actually works, and avoid this being too much of a sales pitch. And then we'll go into some of the aspects which are benefits of the technology, but could also be some of the risks that's of public policy that we'll discuss today, as it relates to leveraging large amounts of detection data and other context data that gets associated and collected with a machine like ours. And then diving in a little bit to the risk to consider when using a technology such as ours as a case study, but also any type of AI or data-driven technology in the context of public safety, since AI utilization is a very hot topic right now, and its utilization with public safety as well. There's a lot of considerations and a lot of decision making that goes into selecting and rolling out these tools. So a little bit about Spectra. We're a Canadian-owned and operated company based in Kingston, Ontario. Most of our team is local to Kingston, with staff around the rest of Ontario and some in BC. We started by commercializing chemical detection technology that was invented in Queen's University, and we started then grow our specialty in narcotics and chemical threat analysis. And several years ago, we had the opportunity to work with multiple federal government partners, including Health Canada, to help tailor our technology for the frontline needs of the opioid crisis. And we still work time to time with the drug analysis labs to this day. Today, we employ multiple PhD level scientists from Canada's top universities, with a focus on enhancing and supporting the capabilities of our technology. So on the right side here is myself, the company's 3 main executives. And if we have the opportunity to work with you, you'll likely be interacting with one of the faces on the right here at some point. So just the context, the impetus of us designing and creating our technology was really the drug supply. The unregulated and illicit drug supply has become more toxic and dangerous than ever. 8 years ago, the headlines would have talked about the surge of fentanyl and mitigating the risks in its impacts. But now it's become even more complicated than that. We have new polysubstance contamination, drugs and synthetic materials that are being mixed with fentanyl. And this year, one of the concerning trends is the reemergence of carfentanil in pockets across the country. So just to give some background on the dangers of this substance, carfentanil was never designed for human use, unlike fentanyl, which has medical purposes. This was designed as an elephant tranquilizer. And this is being made, intentionally put into the drug supply. And indeed, this chemical in other areas of the world has been deployed as a chemical weapon. And so being able to identify hard to detect chemicals like this in drug mixtures has really driven the need for better tools and frontline technology for a variety of reasons, which we'll go into. So really the situation of coming across unknown powder in a search, how do we determine this fast, accurately, and safely? What's in this container a controlled illicit drug or just a household substance? And how can I limit my exposure if there is some risk of substance that could get on a person like an officer in a search? And so in the field, we really, without relying too much on third-party laboratories, which can take time, it's really what Amplifi ID was designed for, is finding out what's in a substance fast, quickly, easily, and then having also sufficient sensitivity to detect what's actually in there. So on the right here is the Amplifi ID machine, which is the spectrometer with our logo on the right, and then its software interface. And so this was really designed in response to the complexity of substances that we find in the field. So we built this to be also intuitive, so very easy to onboard for someone in the front line and not needing a deep research or chemical technical background to be able to operate it. It takes about a couple hours of training and hands-on time for someone to be competent with actually operating the machine. And while we use scientific grade technology, like I said, you don't have to be an expert. The software itself, the analytics software, is able to process the information and provide a plain language result for the end user. And it's built to be applicable to the modern samples we have. And one of the key benefits when it comes to reducing exposure, we have two scan modes, and one of the scan modes is a through barrier detection mode. So you can scan an unknown substance right through with clear packaging, if it's a plastic bag like you see on the right here, or a Tupperware container that's glass or plastic. And so we've had customers like our First Nations policing customer, Rama Police, use this successfully in a situation that was not too dissimilar from the one that I showed earlier. They began using our technology earlier this spring. They had a situation with a unknown powder in a Tupperware container, and were able to reduce their exposure and scan right through to determine that there was in fact a controlled substance in there. So just a little bit about the science of how it does it. Amplifi ID uses laser light to detect unique scattered light signatures from the sample. And scientists sometimes call this type of signal a chemical fingerprint. So these signals are extremely information rich and contain the information that's very specific to the molecules that are present. And so from there, the software takes that signal and then translates that using its algorithms and machine learning models, and translates that into a plain language result for the frontline operator to use. And so having a fingerprint and this type of signal can allow us to detect and differentiate similar molecules, like seeing different forms of fentanyl, or determine the similarities and differences from mixtures, say batch to batch or over time. And so I'll return to this concept of the fingerprint a few times as well, which because it's important when thinking about the use of AI for driving results on a technology like this. And just to quickly show a quick demonstration of what this looks like in practice. So we have a clear packaging, an unknown substance. We scan that right next to the machine. It collects the information, it collects the fingerprint signal. And this is the fingerprint signal here, generates that gets processed into a result. And here we just had acetaminophen powder as the substance that we were looking at. I'll skip over this. So when it comes to an end result, what the user is looking at, we also collect contextual data on the substance as well. So what was it presumed to be? Things like texture and the color, but also we can add geotags and other contextual information and notes that might be associated to a specific incident case with that sample. But in terms of what would be somewhat of a mixed sample and a complex mixture here, this is what an end result would look like to the end user, and then each chemical fingerprint associated with that result as well. Now, when it comes to collecting information for the data tools and intelligence, every test that's run on Amplifi ID is logged in a secure dashboard, accessible right from the interface. And the results can be retrieved at any time, whether it's the frontline operator or their analysts and support staff that are running it back on the station. Every sample is tied to the particular account that it's tested with. And this is all to save the headache of not having a digitized record of a field presumptive test. Now, you're collecting all of this data. You can also do things like provide big data analytics on that, especially when you associate the chemical detection data with other context around the sample as well. So let's take the geotagging, for example. This is a new interface that we've designed, which allows you to map out the trends and visualize what detection results look like across a geography. And you can kind of think of this as the start of a early warning radar system when it comes to substances detected throughout the landscape in Canada. The other thing we can do as well is we're introducing a fingerprint indexing tool. So when it comes to those chemical fingerprints, which allows you to analyze the similarity of samples to prior detections or drug seizures. So seeing over time, if we're seeing a similarity in the chemical fingerprint as it moves from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or even just from batch to batch of a sample that an officer might be testing. So just a recap on the benefits and then going into the specific risks when it comes to this kind of technology in policing. Personnel safety is a big one. So being able to, again, limit that exposure of opening up samples and getting a quick screen on what you were dealing with immediately. Overall, getting these rapid results helps streamline investigations and knowing what you were dealing with, instead of having to wait for the third-party lab result, which, speaking to a lot of law enforcement services, can be a big challenge of waiting for that data. And then lastly is the intelligence sharing. So getting these end results and then also having the contextual data with that and sharing that in between services with all the data that's collected on the platform to start to map trends and triangulate where substances might be emerging from, where they're going, or getting alerts on some new emerging substances. Okay, so that's a quick recap on the benefits, but in terms of the risks, so I'll talk about it in the context of our type of technology when it comes to chemical detection or drug detection technology, but I think this is applicable for any type of AI-based technology or data-driven technology. And so the first consideration is the reliability of the algorithm or the core function, the core mission of what your technology is supposed to do really matters, because trust really matters in public safety and for anything when it comes to high consequence decisions. So I'll actually bring up an example that's happened in Canada back in 2023, so a couple of years ago, where an American traveler was taking a connecting flight through Pearson Airport, got brought into secondary screening, luggage was swabbed for drugs, and was tested positive for cocaine. And this was a field presumptive test, but based off of that test result, they were brought in and had to serve in a correctional facility until the confirmatory test came in for nearly a week. And it was found to be a false positive. There was a substance in the shampoo that the traveler was carrying that led to that result. Now, in this case, this was a very old kind of technology that was being used, but this matters when deploying technology for high consequence decisions, when somebody's rights could be basically taken away in this instance. And so when building out the tools for the core function, which is detection, which could lead to high consequence decisions, knowing what the limitations are around that technology when it comes to specificity and false positive rate is really important, especially if those results, and having a technology that says errs on the side of false positives more often than not, and often will detect drugs even if drugs aren't there. We have to think of the implications here and the risks to marginalized groups or identifiable groups in situations like that. And so building technology responsibly and having the reliability and having transparency around when situations like that happen is really important in the context of public safety, and something that we as a company are very mindful of when we're designing our tools and algorithms when it produces results in frontline environments like that. And then the other side to that coin, similar to reliability, is explainability too. So how does a model or algorithm arrive at its answer? Is it backable? Can we trace back to how it determined to say that this particular sample contained XYZ, it contained fentanyl, or contained no substance at all? Because with models and with AI tools, you can train it with lots and lots of data, but if the approach is just going to be, we're going to throw volume at it, we're not going to have a particular supervision or basis for the data we're throwing at it, we're just going to have it associated with another reference method, you can run into issues like a false positive issue, where your model will spit out results that don't necessarily make sense and won't necessarily be reliable. So understanding how something arrives at its answer is really important from a transparency standpoint and a trust standpoint. So coming back to the chemical fingerprint example, and using forensic drug analysis as an example for it. Now, I should say, for something like our machine, which is used as a presumptive test, it wouldn't be the test that's relied on in, say, a court of law for prosecution, but it's still going to have consequences, just like in the airport traveling example. But so for the context of us, here is an example of a chemical fingerprint, and with our technology, we're able to trace back to how did the model make a decision. And we also have our analytical chemists on call where a result can be reviewed by them. And having that chemical fingerprint, it could also be reviewed by a third-party chemist as well to see the validity of how it arrived at a result. So explainability and how something is doing it. And this can be important for introducing bias. So thinking of other technologies like facial recognition, for example. So the explainability and the underlying decision-making is also very important when considering tools. And then lastly is the privacy considerations and data integrity. So we're collecting large amounts of data when it comes to our device and our machine. And it's not just the detection results, but there's other contexts that can be associated with those results as well. So I mentioned things like the color and texture, adding an image tag of the sample itself, and then any other notes. And then we intentionally do not collect biographical information when it comes to our platform, but the sample IDs associated with this could then be associated with, again, incident cases or occurrence numbers that would be linked into another database. And so, again, when we're thinking about, a potential trend or conclusion that we're coming up with this data, so taking the geotagging, for example, if we're finding that detections of certain substances are showing up in certain areas, being aware of that and how that can introduce particular challenges when it comes to marginalized or identifiable groups, for example. And so making sure that the data is secure is also a point of consideration here. Again, we only collect information, and by design, we only collect information on the sample itself so that we do not risk having this associated with other aspects of data that could be associated with individuals, for example. But these are things, when we're thinking about other technologies, where transparency around how it's being used, and in our situation, it's pretty obvious of when the test is being used because you actually need to have the sample in front of you. But for other considerations like facial recognition technology, that we're looking at a different context where the public might not know that it's being used and where the data is coming from. So different situations, we have a more narrow and very specific focus with our technology, but these are kind of the considerations that we're thinking about when it comes to collecting large amounts of data here. And with that, I will close off. If you're interested in learning more, this is my contact information. I'll try to post this in the chat as well, but I was happy to discuss other elements of the technology, but hopefully this frames and contextualizes the rest of the conversation, and look forward to the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'll just give a second to see if there's any questions about the specifics of the product and the larger issues that are going to be explored today might benefit from waiting for the other two speakers, but not seeing anybody throwing up their hand. John, perhaps you've got some insight that I don't share?
Yes, thanks very much, Mike. Malcolm as a retired physician, I find this fascinating. I can see so much use for instant analysis technology. And in fact, point of care testing has become very, very strong in the healthcare industry. I could see how useful this would be in an emergency department for exactly all the reasons you've outlined for police officers. I'm impressed, actually. How is it in the courts? Have they tested the analyses in a court case?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So at the end of the day, the courts are going to prefer having, and may even require having a Health Canada certificate of analysis or third-party forensic lab certificate of analysis of the test result. And so our test would be used as the presumptive positive. Now, we haven't had an instance where this is now, granted, this is a relatively new technology in the field. We haven't had an instance where this has been challenged in court, and there's a really good basis and precedent for it. So the type of spectroscopy that we use, there's an international scientific working group which categorizes drug forensic identification tools by their differentiation power. The type of spectroscopy we use, Raman spectroscopy, is known as a category A technique. So it has the highest amount of discriminating power. And so in other jurisdictions like the United States, you usually, if you were using field tests, you'd usually want to pair a category A technique with another technique as well, like a color change test. And if you had concordant results, that would in some cases is enough for evidentiary purposes. But this is just being used as a presumptive field test. It wouldn't be used for final prosecution of an individual under the Controlled Substances Act.
Thank you.
Speaking from the police perspective, of course, I think we all appreciate that this could give grounds for a police officer to make an arrest. And the next speaker will be looking at the consequences of such technology. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Tamir Israel. He is the Director of Privacy, Surveillance, and Technology Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. His work focuses on privacy, law enforcement, and national security, surveillance, cybercrime, cross-border data sharing, and the detrimental impacts of artificial intelligence. Tamir is on the advisory board of the Open Media and is a consultant with Human Rights Watch. All of those elements in Tamir's biography, I see having direct application to Malcolm's observations about the use of his product. So I'm looking forward to Tamir's discussion. And if I can just offer also just a slight bit of kind of broader context, just this week, 2 articles were published about the introduction of broader surveillance techniques used by police. Halton Region and Ottawa Police are now introducing broader facial recognition technology. And so today's discussion, I think, might be a segue to explore some of those aspects. Tamir, thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Mike, and thank you so much for having us on this. Just a little bit of background maybe about the CCLA, the organization for which I work. So the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, we're an independent national non-governmental organization, and our mandate is to defend and foster civil liberties and human rights and democratic freedoms across Canada. We do this by through various mechanisms, including various policy-making activities and legislative reform activities, as well as through research and engaging with various types of groups to encourage civil liberties respective practices. We're particularly thankful for the Coalition for Canadian Police Reform for inviting us to speak today. These opportunities for engagement are very important for our work because it gives us a chance to talk about some of the civil liberties concerns that we're seeing in our work, and also an opportunity to engage with people who are using these tools and to get a better understanding of how these tools are operating on the ground. And we value both these things because We're very committed to evidence-based advocacy in our work, and we want to make sure that our work is accurate and informed by how things are working. So with this in mind, I'm going to use the discussion today as a jumping off point for a broader consideration of the framework for adopting various of the emerging technologies that we've heard a little bit about today. But in general, there are a number of technologies that are reshaping policing in a number of ways in Canada and around the world. And some of this is examples of things that are happening elsewhere, but that eventually will make their way here, and that we'll need to assess and figure out how to incorporate into our own policing in Canada. And for CCLA, the concern is really to make sure that there is a framework in place to make sure that the different types of risks that various technologies pose are assessed in a way that that instills confidence in the conduct of policing and and ensures that civil liberties are respected. So, and it's important to note at the outset that different technologies pose different types of challenges and levels of risk, and we've already heard this a few times. And but there are some recurring themes and general approaches that are worth keeping in mind. And this is becoming, and these are, I think, becoming increasingly important as the range of technologies evolves, and their versatility and their ability to do a wide range of different functions evolves. So I'll just highlight a few of these general themes that we see occurring repeatedly in the technological policing space, and then I'll elaborate a bit about them and provide some specific examples including from Spectra Plasmonics tool, and then others as well. And again, the objective here is to make sure that there's a framework in place for assessing how these are adopted, so that they're done in a thoughtful way. Okay, so in terms of general trends, there are essentially three that I want to focus on today. One is that often we see new technologies adopted in a relatively ad hoc manner. And this means that there isn't the chance to really consider carefully in advance. And this isn't a criticism. I would say that a lot of the technologies that are out there today really lend themselves to this type of adoption. And it's something new that we're all going to have to kind of grapple with. But when new policing technologies are adopted in a more ad hoc way, it really bypasses what were historically checks and safeguards in place to consider in a more comprehensive way what the implications of some of these tools are. So this is something that is a concern for us, and I'll provide some examples. Another sort of overarching trend in what we see what we see in raising concerns around some civil liberties concerns around the adoption of various technologies is that even when they are considered at the point of adoption, sometimes that's where the consideration stops, whereas many technologies aren't static in nature, and their use and implications evolve over time. So one-off scrutiny is not always sufficient. And then the final recurring sort of theme that I'll touch on, and again, I'll provide a few examples of each of these, is that many technologies pose specific transparency and accountability challenges, and Malcolm has already highlighted some of these, as well as Mike in his introduction. But really the point, and I'll provide some examples that will hopefully ground that discussion a bit more, but really the point here is that if these challenges aren't addressed, it could really, if there isn't a framework for addressing these challenges, at least, it could really undermine public confidence in their use, even beyond how they're initially intended to be used. Okay, so I'm going to start with discussing concerns around the ad hoc adoption of technology. This poses a particular threat for civil liberties because at the point of adoption, you're able to take a lot of considerations into account and tailor, how the use and training of a particular tool is going to be adjusted based on how it's anticipated, based on its anticipated use. So when you bypass this, you miss that important intervention point. And many technologies are increasingly multi-purpose in nature and very versatile, and can provide a whole range of capabilities. in ways that aren't necessarily self-evident and can pose a significant risk to civil liberties. With a tool like Spectra Plasmonics, the use cases are fairly predictable, as we've seen. And Malcolm, I think, went through the range of them and did a good job of identifying where you would want to maybe have some additional forethought. And so, for example, officer safety is one thing where there's less risk, where there's a lot of benefit for law enforcement to have this ability to identify substances that are risky for police, and little downside in terms of civil liberties on that front on its own. But then if you start using the tool as well as as an investigative step to justify potentially more intrusive searches, or to even arrest a person without having an additional confirmation of the substance in question, then this can raise that you would just want to make sure, if that's an anticipated use case, you would want to make sure that the training around those situations and awareness of what the technology can and can't do is part and parcel of its implementation. And if you do decide, for example, that when adopting this and fully assessing this tool, a tool like this, that maybe it's not, maybe before we actually bring criminal charges against, maybe we don't use it as proof of guilt, because for that we would want to take the substance to a lab and get an additional confirmation that's again a consideration that's brought in kind of at the outset, and a limitation that's kind of expressly acknowledged when the tool is adopted and that everyone's aware of it. It's this type of forethought that we think is really helpful when these new types of technologies are coming in. I'll give another example, though, of a different technology. And this is a sort of a category of technologies really called video analytics, which is very versatile and could have, and we've heard, could have a wide range of use cases. And often when you're adopting it, the technology has all these potential capabilities, right? So even if you're adopting it for one of these reasons, you want to be aware that, it could often be the press of a button or just like one person's decision to use it in this other way that brings in all these other considerations. And again, which again stresses, underscores the need for a bit of forethought from our perspective, and how forethought could really forestall some of the civil liberties challenges that we see down the road. So, for example, video analytics is essentially a type of AI tool that lets you assess video footage for different types of objectives, and it could be used to assess a live video feed, for example, for anomalies that would flag a safety concern, and and then somebody would go and then look at the video a little bit more carefully and decide whether to deploy a police officer. It could be used as an evidentiary tool to assess a large volume of recorded videos to save time, so that the entire video stream doesn't need to be viewed. Or it could be used to search for a particular person across, a centralized assessment capabilities that's pulling in CCTV feeds from an entire city. So each of these, this is like a pretty wide array of use cases, and many of the video analytics capabilities that are being offered commercially would have all of these, would have the ability to do all of these things when they're adopted. And a policing agency might be thinking of one of these, and when they're deciding to adopt one of these tools and putting in specific safeguards to address that particular one. But then, because the capability is already there, it becomes very simple to then, in many instances, to then apply it to these others, and there's a much higher risk entailed, that isn't necessarily considered at the point of adoption, unless, again, there's a proper framework in place for considering all these. There's also sort of an inherent ad hoc, there's also an inherent feature of various types of new technologies that makes their ad hoc adoption a lot easier, and does bypass even this initial assessment that's focused on one objective. And we had this in Canada a bit with a commercial product called Clearview AI, which is essentially like an app, like basically this is a company that went and collected a bunch of social media profiles and images with names attached to them, and then created a facial recognition capability that anyone could then go and install on their phone, take a picture of someone, and then a couple of names pop up. And there's a lot of challenges with this face matching technologies. They're not very accurate, and they have they're often, sometimes they can be accurate, but there's also still pretty meaningful error rates at times, and particularly ones when they're applied, particularly challenges with racial bias when they're applied to specific demographics. So, but because this tool was so readily available and easy to adopt, we had in Canada a number of officers would just go to just on their own adopt this tool without a broader sort of more considered assessment from the policing agency more broadly. And this is this wasn't really as easy to do. This is a technologically driven shift that you're able to adopt this type of tool kind of very easily without this broader sort of set of considerations put in place. And it is a highly intrusive tool that we would classify it as a relatively high risk tool, because it really shifts the ability, because of the biases that we mentioned, but it also really shifts the ability of law enforcement's ability to identify people. As you all know, in general, you're not allowed to go up to someone in the street and just ask them to identify themselves. So so this is an example of a high risk tool that at one point was very easy to adopt. And you would understand why, without a framework in place, why some people would be would consider its adoption in their day-to-day policing. But this is why, again, it's important to consider these things up front. In terms of the need for scrutiny across the entire life cycle of a tool, so often, even when a tool is adopted with a thoughtful process and assessed at point of adoption, many particularly algorithmically driven tools, the risk that they pose evolves over time. So I'll just give one example. So there's a DNA analysis tool that was used, and that is widely used, and basically this tool uses automated processes to conduct DNA matching estimates in situations where traditional DNA analysis aren't available because the DNA sample is too degraded, or it's intermixed with other samples. And this particular tool, so this is very different from what we're looking at here, but in this particular tool, after a few years of use, it was found that there was that the software for the tool had an error built into it, and that its reliability had not been assessed in a rigorous way in the way that we've seen has Malcolm's tool has gone through, and that had been used in ways that had generated significant errors and had been relied on, in many contexts, in ways that led to potentially erroneous outcomes. And what this introduces is that, with some types of tools, the risk for the reliability and bias risks are actually in the software, in addition to the underlying science, particularly software-driven tools. And in these instances, it's not even just so you need a rigorous assessment when you're adopting the tool, but a software update could actually then introduce this something as simple as a software bias update could introduce this bias, even if it wasn't there when you initially adopted it. And then this is even a bigger problem with some types of AI tools, because often these tools are designed in a way that is constantly learning from as it operates, and so you won't necessarily even have something like a software update to trigger the need for an updated evaluation, because the tool is constantly evolving, and bias and error could be introduced at any stage. So again, it's important in that instance, for example, to have something in place if you're relying on a tool like this to constantly be assessing its accuracy and how it's working. Okay, and I'll just very quickly touch on some of the transparency and accountability challenges that we're seeing in emerging technologies. And again, I know we're going beyond the specific tool that Malcolm presented here, but For us, it's important to have these frameworks in place to address these things more comprehensively. And many of these new technologies do pose specific problems for transparency and accountability. Malcolm talked about the need to kind of have some understanding of the logic of and interpretability of how these tools are providing various assessments that people are relying on, but often that isn't there. So in many instances, and this poses a challenge for accountability. So in many instances, we have algorithmic tools that will just provide you with a risk assessment, and you aren't really able to understand what the basis for that assessment is, and that could guide decision making in ways that are really problematic. There was one tool that was used as a reoffending risk assessment tool, even by courts in the United States for a while, before it was found to have some biases built into it. And even in that context where you have a lot of procedural safeguards, right? It was very difficult to disentangle the degree to which the bias from the algorithm was shaping the decisions of the court. So again, it's important to be aware of these accountability challenges and have safeguards in place to make sure that these tools are accompanied with training so that people understand their limitations and the degree to which they can be relied on, especially with these algorithmic tools that have a much more complex, that are conducting very complex assessments without very clear explanation of the factors that go into the assessments. And then very briefly and finally, there's also a lot of transparency challenges that come out of some emerging technologies. And I'll just very briefly use the CCTV example that Mike mentioned, right? And this carries over to other types of video recording capabilities like body-worn cameras. And it's that it's increasingly possible, and the public is aware of this, to overlay different types of analytics like facial recognition or assessment tools that are looking for various types of conduct on top of these pre-existing cameras. And this poses a particular challenge for the public, who's generally aware of that these capabilities are out there, but has no way of knowing if they're really being used in particular interactions or in particular use cases. So this just underscores, and I would say, like, policing forces in Canada have been, fairly upfront with adopting these when they are adopting these tools. But it's important to have a really concrete framework to ensure that that's the case, because otherwise, there's a heightened concern among the public, even that could extend even to situations where the tools have not been adopted, just because there's no way of knowing if the tools are adopted, and there's a general awareness that these tools are in use. And then also to make sure that when limitations are put in place, like these are, whenever you're departing from them, there's an additional transparency step where you have to make that publicly known, so that, and that really just increases confidence in the limitations that are actually in place, unless people, allows for a more, for really greater public confidence in the use of these tools. Now, I focus a lot on highlighting some of the concerns that we have from a civil liberties perspective. I did want to point to, there's a couple of ongoing initiatives that are trying to generate some of these frameworks and best practices that I was hinting at along the way. And there's one I want to particularly point to, which is the Law Commission of Ontario is working on a set of best practices around the adoption of various algorithmic tools. I know there's a number, we're involved in that process, as are a number of other agencies and actors. So I would just encourage everyone to keep an eye out for these best practices as they emerge, and as they do come out, to adopt these frameworks, so that there is a way for these tools to get incorporated in ways that are confidence enhancing. I think I'll stop there. Thank you again for having me here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, I'll give a few people an opportunity to submit a question or two. Again, John, if you're monitoring, perhaps there's somebody who's got their hand up that I don't see.
Oh,
okay.
I'm waiting with bated breath. Neil, you must have a question. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Okay, well, couple of comments just before entering into our next phase. Thanks again, Tamir and Malcolm. And Tamir, you have raised what I think police would consider to be very widespread and significant implications arising out of even this technology. And the fact that the CCLA keeps watch on this can be a helpful tool for police agencies, and I'm pretty sure that Kim can speak to this. But on a specific note, I'd be happy to point out that the CCLA and the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police have an agreement to work on shared matters of interest, where the initiation of a widespread either policy or position adopted by the OECP gets the benefit of the CCLA input before the publication. So one example, and I'll take this opportunity, I'll reinforce it at the end of the webinar as well, but I'll take this opportunity just to promote this kind of cross promotion and mandate sharing that I think could achieve a better outcome for our communities. But now, given the implications surrounding...
Mike, sorry, just to interrupt. David put a good question into the box.
Thanks, John, for... I don't see it in the chat group, but is it something to feed you want to speak to right now?
If you like.
Yeah, I mean, I put it in the chat box. Alcohol breath testing has a very well-established science-based process of assessing suitable devices, and it would be interesting to see if something could be established for all analytical devices that might be used in law enforcement. It would be an advantage for the innovators to be able to know what the criteria, the privacy criteria and all that would be. So have some kind of pre-established framework so that people aren't building things and finding out they're a great device, but a public policy failure at the end.
Thanks, David. Tamir, you have a comment.
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful interjection. And I think and as well, like I put, different sized police forces are not necessarily as well equipped to conduct a lot of this analysis up front. So I do think that replicating some of the forensic reliability assessment tools that we have in Canada and that have been used for things like breathalyzers, and that Malcolm has mentioned, Malcolm has used some of these for, there's health related and other forensic assessment tools. I think maybe expanding these to that model so that there is a framework for some independent assessment of some of these tools, as they're being adopted and later on as they're being rolled out, could be a very helpful way of, moving some of these uses forward in ways that are, cognizant and are able to take into consideration and able to really ensure that the reliability of some of these tools. And then I just wanted to thank as well, Mike, for mentioning that collaboration with the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. Again, for us, it's a very useful vehicle to be able to flag some of the civil liberties concerns that we're seeing on the one hand, and then to also make sure that we're fully understanding how things are working on the ground when assessing the concerns that we're seeing as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Tamir. I see that both Dave and Cal Corley have a question. So I'll give it to Dave first. He's the president after all.
Well, thanks, Mike. I didn't know it carried that much weight. But let me just say this, Mike, you talk about cross cooperation. There you talk about all the different police agencies in Canada, and you can imagine how many there are. And this is very important information, but when we all think about it, there is no central repository. There's no central entity in Canada that could bring this together, that this information would be available, whether it's current and relevant to human rights or to what's important and all of the things with the technology that Malcolm talked about. if there was only one central entity in Canada that would hold all of the knowledge around best practices and things that are really important, because we have 68 or whatever the number of agencies working in different ways around training and education, knowledge of police officers, and there is no entity that shares what you're learning today with any other agency, but a National Center of Policing Excellence that only focuses on training, education, knowledge in current and relevant subjects, and building a curriculum, a gold standard curriculum, is so beneficial to Canadians and to all of us in this very important work that we do. So please, if I might ask all of you, think about the long-term potential of a National Center of Policing Excellence and what potential it has to improve the quality of policing in Canada and the knowledge of police officers. So thanks, Mike, for allowing me to interject at that with respect to this. And I ask Cal, please go ahead. And Cal, thanks for being with us today.
Cal, you'll need to turn your mic on.
I think I'm there now. Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I think my question flows pretty much from what you were just saying, Dave. And Malcolm and Tamir both want to thank you for really good and enlightening presentations. Tamir, I think we probably all echo those concerns, some of the concerns that you've raised. And particularly when I think about, the new generation of police officers and the new generations of police leaders coming in who are digital natives and, using new technologies isn't even a second thought. Now, picking up on what Dave was saying, recently the International Association of Chiefs of Police introduced what they call their connector program, and it's to support law enforcement agencies, particularly in the States, but internationally as well, I guess, in identifying, researching new technologies. So it's an online platform, and if an agency is looking at introducing something, they can go online, see if it's been evaluated by this connector program at the IACP, and see what it's got to say about it. Some recent chiefs that I was talking to just around, not so much well, it does play in technology, but there's a chief of a medium-sized agency here in Ontario that was approached by his police association lead and some of the members, and it was around trauma experienced by the membership. And it was a technological solution, and believe it or not, it involved 4 wires that you connected to the head and left on for a period of time. And it was a fairly expensive piece of technology, and this particular chief had said, well, I want to reach out to some experts. And he reached out to some experts across the country, and they said, well, first of all, anything that involves 4 wires connected to your head, there ought to be some real good research on it. All to say, I'm with Dave in terms of I think we'd be well advised in Canada, and I applaud the OACP for the relationship that they've developed with Howard Sapers and his team at CCLA. I think that's a really a good step forward. But I like the idea of a repository and something like what they're doing in the States with this connector, taking it to a Canadian audience, and whether however that's managed, I think we'd all be served very well for it. Particularly, as I say, we're going into an era now which policing is going to soon be led by people that are digital natives and aren't going to have a second thought about many of the unintended consequences that can occur around these. With that, I'll be quiet. Thank you very much. Look forward to any reactions you've got.
Thanks, Cal. There was somebody waiting, but I'm going to ask the questioners right now just to hold forces, because these avalanche now, this big, huge snowball of implications is going to drop directly into the laps of policing in this case. And to talk about preparing and equipping police services to respond to the introduction of new technology, seeking out new technology, and all of the implications that go with it. The implications in this case are around the derivative use of the product, as well as the actual technology that the product brings to bear, and the use of the collection of information, use of information. So to that end, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Chief Executive Officer and a very dear personal friend of mine, former Deputy Chief of Toronto Police Services, Kim Derry. Kim is the Chief Executive Officer of Consilium Public Sector Services. Consilium offers a range of services to all levels of government, focusing on strategic initiatives that take into account, very appropriate for today's discussion, evolving community developments. Kim retired from the Toronto Police Service in 2011 after a 38-year career. During his 6 years of Deputy Chief, he was responsible for the operation of 17 police divisions. And if anybody knows a little bit about Toronto, you'll know that these divisions are entire little police services on their own, and over 4,000 members who reported up to Kim. He was responsible for a budget of over $400 million, led key organizational reviews, and informed major strategic decisions that for both the police service and the police services board. So Kim has experience in governance as well. A particular point of distinction for Kim is that in 2010, he became the first non-US citizen to head the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Academy Associates. This is an organization of graduates. It's an international organization, international graduates from the FBI Academy. So a very distinguished and prestigious position for Kim indeed. During that tenure, he oversaw an agency that represented over 18,000 law enforcement leaders from 165 countries. He now leads an organization of what I would consider to be policing experts across the entire spectrum of policing operations, from technology through policy, practice, and procedures. So actually, Kim has a pretty big mandate in today's webinar to tell us what he might consider to be helpful suggestions or recommendations to impart upon policing. So Kim, happy to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thank you both from Malcolm's perspective and also from Tamir's perspective. I'm not going to go over our company. We do provide consulting services across Canada. We are now in 7 provinces and many experts, as Mike said. But a component of our service is we've been identifying Canadian vendors that are able to improve operational outcomes. Many police and public services are challenged, and you've all raised those issues but part of it is also reducing bottlenecks through workflow assessments, throwing technology without going through a lot of those tasks. And I think even Tamir said it, sometimes technology is advanced by ad hoc acquisitions. We've done a study across Canada, and a lot of technology acquisitions are in fact cut short. They're not put in perfect ways, and that is a challenge. The second challenge in policing right now is the increasing data streams and the systems and the volumes of data they're producing. AI is here. The reality is, how do we put the guardrails in place to make sure that AI meets the needs of the justice system, the legal system, as well as the public system? And in some cases, the public is being impacted by various issues, but the technology in some cases can save officers and save the public, such as Malcolm's technology. It's webinars, I think, like this that can inform the development of public policy and address privacy, governance. This is one of the things that our company does look at. The governance, the handling of data, the compliance issues, the retention of other challenges as well. And I think this is where Tamir mentioned it, is looking at future needs or the technology advances. And do they do the PIA's privacy impact assessments ongoing? We actually now working with a company out of Toronto that actually does automatic PIAs and does all the technology assessment at the same time looking at the legal reasons by which they can move forward. So what used to take 3 or 4 weeks can actually be done in hours and days. And with all the legal factors that are pointing to all the issues. Today, we're looking at innovation technology that can be used by law enforcement as for health, as well as for officers that are drug units or border patrol, where it enables the introduction of a safe way of testing, testing. But as Malcolm said, there's going to be data. So where do we go from there? As we discuss, public policy implications may need to be addressed that will enable specific drug testing tools and data outcomes to be utilized that can enhance law enforcement, as well as dealing with the public safety needs. And then the investigative capabilities. How does that impact? Somebody mentioned earlier, can you use that in court? Well, maybe not right now, but like all technology, and I remember even back in the 80s when we had some drug testing ampules, we'd have to break them. And then we would go to court and they'd say, well, how did you know that? And we say, well, we don't know how it works, but it indicated it was cocaine or it was heroin. And that was enough to justify reasonable probable grounds. It wasn't enough to get from an arrest standpoint, but obviously the Health Canada testing was the actual document needed. But the reality is, we look at data from a technology standpoint as part of a larger issue, and that's the metadata pipeline. And some of you have talked about frameworks. We're now looking and working with a group that is talking about the metadata pipeline. That model takes the chaos, I think, out of managing data in a new emerging governance model of content creation, content clarity and control, which have all raised, the supply chain management of handling data with cybersecurity and governance, and validation and approved processes. That model provides confidence to the public and to government entities that the data that they're using is acceptable, lawful, and meets the public expectation, including validation of the data, which is compliant to all the needs within Canadian law enforcement, justice communities, and obviously with civil liberties. I think today's rapid change, there's always healthy tension when technology is used to enhance security and determine if it affects the Canadian Charter of Rights, freedom of values related to privacy, and we need to work together to make Canada safe. Working with, obviously, Canadian Civil Liberties, as well as other organizations, I think also helps the technology industry actually focus and could deliver what we want and need as opposed to what they want us to use. And I believe that technology used by law enforcement is generally accepted when the evidence rules, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, privacy laws are seen to be balanced with the lawmakers, justice, and the public. Similarly, technology accepted within law enforcement when technology tools are in sync with process governance and outcomes. And obviously that transparency. So some of the things that we're doing with our company, we do a lot of what you've just been talking about with assessing the companies we work with. Plasmonics, drug detection, we became aware of probably a year ago. We worked with, obviously, with Malcolm and others, and we have really sort of seen the benefits that it can use and the potential it can use for health and safety on both the public and the police, but also from a standpoint of investigation and how do we move that forward with the guardrails that are in place that the public can be comfortable with. I think when we look at creating a model, the design of technology that clearly furthers enforcement or medical purposes, we ensure that in this case, drug testing is capable of achieving articulated purposes. You look at cost, assess the impact of public use in the Canadian Charter of Rights, each company, and we're working now with a new body-worn company in Canada. We look at FOI companies that are doing now a lot of technology, but again, Canadian. Data storage is sovereign as versus the other areas of data that is being stored and being shared in other countries without our express permission. And as well as investigative tools and analytic tools. Some of you have talked about facial recognition. You've talked about body-worn cameras. They're all excellent tools that ensure that, police may be being looked at in a much broader way. But the reality is it's generating data, and it's generating data that is monumental. And as a result, our police services across Canada, and we're working with maybe close to 40 right now, are swamped. And they're looking at ways that they can manage data with AI, with other tools, and there's no model in place. There's no standards in place. And yet, we still have to move forward and keep things moving. So as a result, like I said, we're working with a group of people now engaged with the federal government and with justice and talking about this data model. And I think that one of that or the outcome of that, and I know speaking with the group, make sure that CCLA is part of that discussion. But I really do think that a data pipeline model will address some of the issues, and it'll also create a model that we can all work with, that then I think you can look around the globe as far as the assessment of tools and start to have standards that the police in Canada can actually look at and sort of say, that meets the model, it meets the expectations of the public, and we're very comfortable that we can go through a procurement process in those particular ways. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk about our company, and I look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Kim. And it has been my habit for the last little while. Do we have some questions or comments? Okay. Well, a couple of observations, and perhaps it's open to any speaker to respond. The implications, as I think we've identified, are issues around data collection, data security, derivative use. I'd like to point out a couple of operational considerations for policing. When we use Spectra Plasmonics product, it's likely going to be in circumstances where we have individuals involved. Perhaps they're the subject. We're testing something we discovered on a subject. It's going to give rise to, as we said earlier, perhaps some reasonable grounds in order to make an apprehension, maybe a prosecution. But what if the information came to us through a complainant or a witness, not somebody actually engaged in the possession or the use of that product? Now we're starting to collect information on third party. And you can start to see where the CCLA starts thinking about, well, what are these larger implications? Now, from my perspective, this is not Spectra Plasmonics' challenge, although they're interested because they're the product that's being used at the time, and it's going to get associated to the collection of data. Now, the technology, as I understand it, means that the information is shareable. Well, the information is going to be housed in police databases as well. And what are the police going to use that for? Tamir mentioned facial recognition as an issue. Well, police officers are equipped with in-car cameras and body-worn cameras. So now we're collecting this kind of visual data along with the information. So we can see where the implications start to cascade. And then Kim's observation about, as an organization that consults with and makes recommendations to policing agencies, those considerations become on an order of magnitude that even large organizations struggle to cope with. And then in Canada, largely in Canada, it is not the police service that sets policy. It's its board of governors. Boards of governors are by no means police experts. They'll be quick to tell you. They are the community's representatives helping to govern policing. Where are they going to get their expert knowledge to help form a sound public policy? So this is a bit of a long way of me acknowledging that we need a community of contributors to help these authorities cope with these issues. And I'd like to point out that the coalition has established itself as that mandate. And as Dave alluded to, I'm going to shamelessly insert a commercial here for the National Center for Policing Excellence. And I'm going to leave it at that at this point because I want it to be a teaser so that you'll go out and make contact with us to learn more, because it's a sophisticated, in my opinion, sound proposal. But we need some momentum behind it. We need to convince the federal government, in this case, because we're talking about a national perspective, to make the investments that policing desperately needs. However, I would be amiss if I didn't note that there are some trans-Canada policing agencies that exist. You might be familiar with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. This ostensibly represents police leaders from across Canada, including the federal police agency, the RCMP. And I would say, speaking both personally, and I think I can be objective from a professional point of view, this is a group of very enlightened, progressive people who think about the very issues we've talked about today. I think one of the more progressive forces in our community are police leaders, because we actually are hungry, curious, passionate about advancing policing as a public service. And as Peter Lennox will often emphasize, we're not a police force, we're not a police department, we're a police service, interested in helping our community not just be safe, but be well. There's also provincial chiefs of police associations that our group here can access or inquire about. And then there are also both Canadian and provincial boards of governors associations that would benefit. Now, the coalition encourages curiosity at the very least, or interest from these agencies to varying extents of success. Our webinar series is one way to do it. Can I ask you all, promote the coalition, because we will promote you as a forum where information can be exchanged and perhaps even policy can be developed, at least recommended policy. So I would encourage us all to cross-promote whenever we get the opportunity. Okay, I've preached enough. I am hoping in the remaining 10 minutes that we can get a comment or two or a question or two from the wider audience. Anybody want to chime in? And now's the time to dig a little bit deeper. I see Dr. Lilly. Please, John, jump in.
Thanks, Mike. I put a musing in the chat. We know that the genealogy DNA data has resulted in charges decades after a crime was committed, a murder. So I can imagine a scenario 20 years from now, perhaps, where there's data analysis. Oh, there was a trace of cocaine in the guy's shoes, and a facial analysis from the new body-worn facial recognition system that's being used as a trial in Edmonton starting this week, which will obviously grow much more common. And then other things like crimes for which there are convictions, but in the end result is the multiple facets of information, not just DNA, but all these other factors could indirectly result in a suspicion of complicity in a previous unsolved crime. Is that a logical statement?
Go ahead, Tamara.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the trajectory we're on. And part of the concern is, and DNA is, I think, still considered probably the gold standard when it comes to forensic accuracy and reliability. And that's true for many other tools have very high levels of reliability. I think the challenge is that as more and more data becomes available and some of we get a broader range of tools being employed, hopefully with the right framework in place, but if not, the concern is that some of these tools will have less reliability, and you're going to have people are going to be, especially if it's something that happened many years ago and the reliability is maybe not as robust as you have with the DNA matching. People are going to be in a position where it's particularly difficult to start proving what happened 20 years ago, and there is as well this, when it comes to technology in particular, one of the concerns that we're seeing is that it sometimes has this sort of, it almost feels like magical in a way. So like if an algorithm spat it out, it's really difficult sometimes to explain. I think folks like you understand this, but it's difficult sometimes to explain to, like, say, a juror or even a judge, right? Like how this process can go awry. So it's these types of concerns that for us are we just want to make sure that there are the proper frameworks in place for when these tools, like when we start getting maybe more usage of these tools in ways that are a little bit more open-ended and down the road. And again, we are amassing a lot of footage these days, and it is being kept for long periods of time. So you could see scenarios like that, which just makes it all the more important that the right framework is in place to ensure that the tools that are being adopted in this way are rigorously vetted for accuracy and lack of bias and all these other considerations.
Thanks, Tamir.
Thanks, Tamir. Dave, have you got a comment?
Yeah, no, just a quick question. John alluded to a pilot project in Edmonton now where they link their body-worn cameras. That is the facial recognition on the body-worn cameras is obviously they're going to use it for either investigative purposes or other means. Do any of you know of any other agency in North America that has linked their body-worn cameras with facial recognition technology? That's the first question. And the second question is, here's a point that here's another example, is we really don't know where that technology is going to lead. And that's important, obviously, after our conversation today. My experience in Edmonton is they're going to make sure that they do it right, that there's not going to be a fallout from it, but there is a potential for fallout. And that's why these conversations and factual information provided sort of free of charge to all agencies by a National Center of Policing Excellence is important. That's why the National Center has so much potential. So please, if in your conversation with others, you could promote what we're trying to achieve, and that's all we're trying to achieve. We have no other motivation. It's just to elevate the police profession in Canada. Please talk about our National Center and what its potential is. And thanks, Mike. I see Neil Dubort has his hand raised.
Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Mike. And first of all, Tamir and Malcolm, thank you for your presentation, and Kim as well. Thank you. I appreciate all the work that's being done on this. There's a point here that I think is so important as well. As you know, some of the larger agencies, and whether it be Toronto, Peel, OPP, Edmonton, Calgary, some of those agencies have the resources to be able to look at this appropriately and adequately. I'm going to speak for the mid-sized to smaller agencies as well. And unfortunately, they don't have the resources, but they still are trying to do some of these experiments. And without some sort of national coordination, it becomes very difficult, because the people that will set the bad precedent will be these smaller to mid-sized agencies, unfortunately. So there's value in being able to have coordination at the national level. And certainly, Cal stole my other point. I had my hand up previously in relation to the IACP connector. I think something like that, even in Canada, in relation to IT specifically, it can be very valuable in us being able to share our opinions and be able to coordinate policy across the country. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much. This is the first one I've attended, and I've enjoyed it very much. And sorry I can't get my video working, but at least my audio is going now.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Neil. Kim, have you got a question or a comment?
No, but just talking about to Neil, or that question. In England, there is a model there where they've got 43, I think, police services. and they actually share out a lot of the different research to doing focused on X goes to this service, Y goes to this service, and everybody benefits from it. It is a discussion that, believe it or not, and I think Cal was around at the time, 20 years ago, we started talking about that at CACP and OACP, and trying to come up with a model of where different things could be tested at different places, different services, mid-sized services, small services. We work with both all different levels of services, and you're quite right. Most of the smaller services don't have the resources to be able to put the practices in place, but they still require those technologies. And it's interesting because they do without, because they can't afford it. And so we're having to look at a different model in Ontario now. I mean, you've got Optic, which has got 43 agencies in it. The largest one being the OPP, and the smallest one I think is Elmer with 12 in it. So you've got a big range of police services. How do you then, select a product or a technology that the various agencies would like? And I think there's many discussions, well, let's just come up with one. And I don't think that's the right answer. I think you've got to look at models where there's several product lines, but that they're all meeting the same standards. And I think the companies that we talk to would love to have standards so that they could build their tools to meet the needs. And then coming back to Dave and Mike's thing, if standards are what is required, then having that one central agency that focuses and creates those standards by which we all do, maybe that ends up being you guys as being the that could eventually emerge, that could be that standards of technology as a piece of the pie. So I just throw that out.
Well, Kim, you're quite right. I mean, a national technology platform for police officers, but a national forum for just the exchange of gold standard information, the most current and relevant, and of course, what we're trying to do is a National Center of Policing Excellence. The National Center of Policing Excellence has the potential to sort of bring all of that together.
Yep.
What it needs is initial federal government support and funding just to get off the ground. And after that, I believe the National Center has so much potential, it will explode. And it will just provide police agencies, the smaller, mid-size, and larger, with immediate current and relevant information, because my vision is that nobody would have to go to the center and ask a question. As soon as it's developed and prepared and we know it's credible, it would go out automatically to them free of charge. And the potential is incredible. Never mind technology, but the knowledge and education and many other issues that are so important in policing. And again, we're not talking about policies and procedures for police organizations with respect to standards. We're only talking about knowledge. That's all. Only knowledge for them to improve. Thanks, Mike and Kim, for your comments. Tammy, or?
Yeah, sorry. I think I was going to say something along similar grounds. Something like a National Center of Excellence to inform of emerging best practices and standards as they're coming out. It would be integral, as well as a mechanism to, that instead of having this is the approved tool, but maybe having some sort of mechanism where different forces that are contemplating adopting a tool can submit it and it could be assessed, and it could provide some sort of assessment to see, well, this tool is reliable in these instances and maybe in these others, but not in these third situations. And then also a framework for having discussions like this over, where are maybe some of the lines around what is maybe too intrusive, what is less intrusive. Just to have that discussion occur more broadly. I think these are all very valuable things that, and that having some of the mechanisms that are being proposed here could could really be filling a lot of gaps that we don't have, that will facilitate public confidence in policing more broadly.
Well, thanks, Tamir. Well, keeping an eye on the time, keeping an eye on the time. I think we can probably wrap up. Any final comments that somebody's really urgently insisting on making? Okay. Otherwise, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our presenters and my gratitude to everybody who joined us. You're all emissaries who can now share information, not only on what you just learned today, and I, for one, learned quite a bit, but also on the forum that allows for this information exchange, and celebrate it. And I encourage you to make reference to it. And then, as Dave has pointed out, kind of picking up on the themes that everybody seems to agree to, the CCPR is very interested in convincing the federal government to establish a national center. As I said, we have what we consider to be a sound concept that could persuade the federal government that their investment would pay dividends. One of our challenges is access to the government officials. So if any of you have pathways that can get us access, I would ask you to consider offering that to us so that we can get an audience. If we can spend a bit of time with the appropriate ministers at the federal level, and I certainly think the Solicitor General is probably the first place to go, or the most appropriate, I think we can make a compelling, if not convincing, argument that an investment by the federal government would be a legacy investment. It would pay dividends for policing and community safety and well-being generations into the future. So if you do have avenues that you can offer us to get an opportunity to speak to, at the very least, the staffers of the ministers, if not the minister themselves, we'll take it from there. Dave, anything left? Otherwise, I'm prepared to say thank you, everybody.
Yeah, no, my personal appreciation to Mike, to everyone. Thank you very much. A very informative session.